Welcome to the 1 Million Years of Joy podcast. I'm Dr. Andrea Benaker, your host, and my intention is to inspire you to find more joy in your life through the stories from our guests and the science on joy and purpose. Welcome, everybody. I'm delighted to introduce to you my latest guest. He's a Wall Street Journal and USA Today bestselling author. Josh Steimle generated over $10 million in revenue for businesses he owns by building a thought leadership system that includes books, speaking appearances, and over 300 articles in publications like Fortune, Time, Forbes, Inc., Mashable, TechCrunch, and Entrepreneur. Josh is a creator of the 7 Systems of Influence framework used by entrepreneurs, educators, parents, and community leaders to build influence and increase impact. Josh, welcome. It's an immense pleasure to talk to you today.
Thank you so much, Andrea, for having me on your show.
Great. So let's begin talking about joy and what brings you joy. You've had so many accomplishments, Josh. Maybe you can share a little bit more about yourself, the more positive journeys that you've had. And as you look at your life and everything that you've accomplished, what is that one single thing that you keep referring to that as the most joyful moment in your life?
Well, a lot of the joy that I've experienced has actually come from learning from the failures I've experienced. When I started my business as an entrepreneur, for example, I thought that what I really wanted was I wanted to be a millionaire by the time I turned 30 years old. I had that as a specific goal. I wrote it down. I had a deadline. And I thought by the time I'm 30, I'm going to have $1 million in the bank, and then I'll be happy. And when I got to age 30, I was still an entrepreneur. I did not have $1 million in the bank. I almost had $1 million in debt. So I was going the wrong way. And I wasn't very happy either. But as time went on, circumstances forced me to confront the fact that the money really wasn't what interested me. And that's probably why I wasn't making the money. What really interested me was the people I was working with and seeing the people that I was working with progress. And there are specific people in my business that I hired on in one place, and then they grew and they got promoted and they took on more responsibilities. And I was able to have a small part in helping them grow. And that's really what brought me satisfaction and joy. And in my own life, it was the same thing. Learning, growing, going through new experiences. That's what really brought me joy. And as I look at other parts of my life, whether it's my family, whether it's my relationships with friends, it's the growth and the progress that really brings me joy. And I love that because it doesn't cost me anything other than time and some effort, but I don't have to have money.
I love it. Tell us about your kids. And I know you've adopted some of your kids, and one of your daughters was adopted from China. I'd love for you to share a little bit that experience, how challenging it was. I want to connect this with how you bring joy to others, because particularly when you're bringing a child into your life that has had other experiences before, tell us a little bit more about that journey itself and how do you bring more joy now to the people really close to your life?
The story of adopting our daughter from China is truly miraculous. I'll try to summarize it up because I'm working on a book of this and I'm up to about 300 something pages on it. So it's not a short story. But the short version of it is that we adopted our first child. She was a girl. We adopted her as an infant here in the United States. And exactly 2 years later, we had our biological, which was our son. He's now 13. Our first daughter is 15. And after we had our boy, we thought, my wife and I, we had struggled with fertility, but we thought we were fixed after our son was born. So we were still trying to get pregnant and grow our family, and it just wasn't happening. And after a few years, we decided to look into adopting an older child because we were kind of behind, right? So we felt like we need to catch up. We need to adopt an older child. And we had some other experiences, spiritual experiences that were pushing us in that direction. And so we started looking into adoption. We started looking into adopting from overseas. And we ended up settling on China and feeling like, what are we going to do to help this child enter our home? Because if we go adopt a child from China, there's no prep on her side. All she knows is that one day somebody shows up and they take her away and they take her to the United States. There's no learning English. There's no adjustment to food. It's just one day to the next. And we thought there's nothing we can do about that, but maybe we could do something on our side to ease that transition for her. And so we decided to move to Asia, and we ended up living in Hong Kong and then China for almost 6 years to learn the language, food, culture, and everything so that when we brought this girl into our home, she would have a little bit easier transition because we would understand where she was coming from and the things that she was missing, and we'd be able to communicate at least a little bit with her. And we hoped that we would find her while we were living in Asia. And we didn't plan on being there for 6 years. We thought, oh, 1 or 2 years, it'll just be a little adventure, and then we'll come home with our new daughter. But we ended up being there for 6 years, and we didn't find her during those 6 years. So we came home, and we had been home just a few months, and our agency sent us her profile. And this was about the 50th profile that we had looked at. They kept sending us profiles, and I'd look at them. I'm like, no, that's not her. I feel like that's just not her. And finally, they sent us this 50th profile, and I looked at it and I said, that's her. That's the one. And she was almost 14. And when you turn 14 in China, you can no longer be adopted. There's a strict cutoff. And we had about 3 months to do all the paperwork and rush through everything and get over there. And we were able to adopt her just 1 week before she turned 14. And now she's in our family, and she's 17 years old. And she's like every other American 17-year-old teenager. She loves her phone and her friends and having fun. And she went to the Taylor Swift concert the other night, and that's what she's into. And we're just thrilled to have her in our family.
Wow, thank you for sharing that story. So beautiful. So I can imagine the joy you and your wife must have brought with your other children when she was adopted. The joy you must have brought to her must have been immense, right? Particularly because of that cutoff. I mean, for her, it was almost like, that's it. I'm not going to get adopted, right? I mean, for a child that has been looked at, let's just say, through the adoption process, maybe by other families, and did not necessarily make it, the joy she must have felt must be incredible.
Well, that's the funny thing, is that sometimes what you wish was a happy ending turns out to be maybe a rougher beginning towards something that's a long-term happy ending. The fact is, when we adopted her, she didn't really want to come with us. She was happy there. She liked her life. She had friends. She was 14. She had friends at school, and she wanted to stay there. And the adoption workers kind of put some pressure on her to say, hey, like, this is your last chance. You don't get another chance to be part of a family, and you're going to get to go to the US and learn English, and it'll be this amazing experience for you. And so they really pressured her, and she came with us, but it was pretty obvious she didn't want to come with us. And even after she got to the US, you'd think, oh, well, she'll adjust after a few months and then she'll like it. Well, she liked some things. I mean, she liked going to see Taylor Swift the other night, and she just got a car, and she has a job, and she likes some things, but still she says, hey, I want to go back to China. I miss my friends. I want to go back. And so we're looking at this as, this is more of a long-term thing. And this is the same with any child that you have, whether they're adopted or biological, or you adopt them older or younger, is that when you have teenagers, you learn as a parent that teenagers don't always appreciate the things that you wish they would appreciate. But that's part of the trick of being a parent, is looking at the long term and seeing, well, where does this go 20, 50, 100 years out? And looking at that long term, I'm positive that 80 years from now, she'll probably look back and say, I'm so glad that things worked out the way that they did. But now that she's a teenager, she's not exactly in that place.
So with this perspective in mind, I'm curious, maybe in a couple of years, what advice would you give your kids as they start being fully independent and unleashing their wings, pursuing a career? What tips would you give them to find more joy in life based on your personal experience?
Based on my personal experience, two of the things that I share with my kids is, number one, have the long-term perspective, because it really changes everything. And it seems like so much of the misery and suffering that we see in the world these days is the result of short-term thinking. It's people making decisions based on what's good for me right now, today, tomorrow, next week, but they're not thinking about next year or 5 years or 10 years or 20 years down the road. I remember I met with a gentleman once who had counseled thousands of couples on marriage. So he had seen a lot of couples who stuck together and a lot of other couples who got divorced. And he said, with the couples who got divorced, and he said, especially couples who would get divorced 2-3 times, he said so often they would come back to him and they would tell him, if I had known how hard it would be with my second or third wife, I would have stuck with the first one. They thought things were going to be easier. They had a short-term perspective. They thought, oh, I can get out of this relationship. I'll just jump into a new one that will fix everything. And it didn't. And they realized some things just take work and some things take a lot of time. But when we have that long-term perspective, when we're thinking 50, 100 years out, and we're thinking about not just our lives, but the lives that come after, we tend to make better decisions, I think, and decisions that actually lead to more of the short-term joy that we're really after. So that's one thing that I try to share with my kids is have a long-term perspective. Think about the big results that are going to come decades, centuries down the line from the choices that you make today. And the other thing that I try to instill in my children is that so much of the joy that comes from life is the journey, not the destination. When we focus on the destination, it really pushes us into that short-term thinking. When we're thinking about the destination, we're thinking, all right, I'm going to suffer a bunch, but then I'm going to get to the end and then I'll be happy. And I just have to go through all this suffering to get there and be happy. But sometimes we get to the end and we're not that happy. And really what I found is the things that bring me the most joy, it's the journey itself. And maybe there's some sort of conclusion, but really it's the journey where I find the joy. When I was talking earlier about how what really brings me joy in my business is seeing the people that I work with progress, there's no destination there. It's not like one day we reach some point and I say, okay, we're done. Oh, this is so great. It was so hard, but now we're here and we're done. That's not where I find the joy. It's in the everyday things. It's every day that I'm working with somebody and I'm thinking, wow, look at where this person is. Look at what they're doing. Look at how they're progressing. And yesterday they did this. Today they're doing this. Tomorrow they're going to be here. It's that whole journey. I'm getting joy all along the way. I don't need to wait for some event at the end of 10 years to get my joy. I'm getting my joy all the way along the path.
So tell us more now about your entrepreneurship journey and all the amazing articles you have written for all the publications that I mentioned earlier. And tell us also about the books you have written. And I know that one of those books specifically led you to actually meet Richard Branson. Can you share a little bit more about that? And was that a joyful moment for you or not?
It was a joyful moment. It was a lot of fun. And the way that this all happened is that I started my business, my marketing agency in 1999. And then I kind of failed my way forward for the next 13, 14 years. My business did well enough to keep me engaged and keep me alive, but it wasn't doing anywhere close to as well as I hoped it would when I started it. And so I went kind of stumbling forward for all these years. And then in 2013, everything really changed. And that's when I got the opportunity to write for Forbes magazine. A friend of mine introduced me to an editor she knew over there. They invited me to write for Forbes. And I started writing these articles. And all of a sudden, people cared about what I was writing. I'd been writing for years before. I had written thousands of blog posts, but nobody was really reading my blog. All of a sudden, once it was on Forbes, then everybody cared about what I was saying. And so I was having a lot of fun writing for Forbes. And that opened my eyes to, gee, I guess I'm a writer. I'd never really thought about it before. But once I was writing for Forbes, I thought, people like what I write. I'm writing for a big publication. I guess I'm a writer. I guess that's part of who I am. And I dove into that and started writing for all sorts of other publications, anywhere that I could get into, really, because I was just loving the process, loving doing it. And then I started thinking, well, gee, if I can write all these articles, I could probably write a book. Maybe I should go write a book. And I ended up writing this book called Chief Marketing Officers at Work. It's part of a series from a publisher called A Press, and they do VCs at work and entrepreneurs at work. And I wanted to do this Marketers at Work book. So I wrote this book, Chief Marketing Officers at Work, and that was great in and of itself. I got to interview CMOs from Spotify, Target, PayPal, all these amazing companies. But a few months after that book came out, I got an email from somebody and they said, hey, we're putting together this group of marketers on Necker Island with Richard Branson. It's his private island, and we'd like you to come. And I thought, this is some sort of spam thing, right? Because why would anybody be inviting me to hang out with Richard Branson on Necker Island? Like, I'm a nobody. I've written a few articles. I've got this book out, but I don't get invited to these types of things. So I almost deleted this email. And I looked at it and I thought, well, wait a second. She used my name. She referenced my book. It seems like she wrote this email just to me. And I thought, well, maybe she is sending it just to me, but this probably costs $50,000 or something to go attend to this. And it's some sort of scam that way where it's a real thing, but it's going to cost so much money. There's no way I could afford it. And so I responded to the email. I said, hey, it sounds interesting. What's the catch? How much does this cost? And she responded and said, no, I'm reading your book right now. I really like it. We're putting together all these marketers and I want to invite you. We'll pay for everything other than transportation. You just get yourself here, but all your lodging for the whole week's covered and you'll hang out with us. It'll be amazing. And I thought, okay, I can afford a plane flight. So I flew out and I stayed on Necker Island for a week. And I didn't know Richard Branson would be there. I thought, oh, maybe we're just renting his island or something. I mean, why would Richard Branson actually be there? But the first night we were there, Richard Branson comes walking out into our group, and there were about 70 people in the group on the island. And he just comes walking out and starts hanging out with everybody and chatting, and everybody's taking photos with him and talking with him. And he ended up being there the whole week. And we played tennis with him and hung out and went snorkeling and all this stuff. And it was amazing. And I was hanging out with these marketers. I was the smallest guy there by a long shot. I mean, I'm there with like the head of marketing for Nike and the founder of Foursquare and an executive from Twitter and a head of Time Magazine. All these amazing people. The head of the biggest ad agency in the world was there. And I'm hanging out with all these people. I'm like, how did I get here? And it was just the book. I wrote a book. It happened to catch somebody's eye at the right time. And I got that invitation. So it was an amazing experience. It was a lot of fun.
And how's Richard when you actually meet him in person? Tell us about some of the discussions you maybe had with him.
He was really awkward. It was funny because I thought, here's this amazing entrepreneur who has started over 400 companies. He's a billionaire. He's on the news all the time. He's going into space. And you get this idea that this person is ultra confident. Every word they say is going to just be amazing and they can do no wrong. And I asked him a simple softball question. And he was stuttering. He's like, I'll get back to you on. He was just really awkward. And I thought, this is kind of funny. Like, this is just a normal guy. And I caught him off guard with an easy question and he didn't know how to answer it on the spot. And I thought, that's kind of interesting.
And what are some of the things that are really bringing you the most joy today as a result of writing various books? And tell us also about the podcast that you actually have as well that is more geared towards authors. Can you tell us a little bit more?
Sure. So I have ADHD and shiny object syndrome. I love starting things. I have a hard time finishing things. And it's the same with businesses. It's the same with books too. So I have about 6 books that are in progress. I have 2 that are published, well, 2.5, I guess you could say, that are published. And then I've got about 6 more that are in different stages of being written at the moment. And it's the same with businesses. I have a couple of businesses and some of them are doing great. And some of them I'm kind of like, oh, why did I start this thing? But I just love writing the same way that I love starting businesses. And I love books. I love reading. I grew up reading. My mom read to me when I was a little kid and instilled in me a love of books and a love of reading. And that's stuck with me my entire life. And so now I'm writing books, but I'm really interested in the craft of writing books. And so I started a company called Published Author, and we coach executives and entrepreneurs on how to write business books, how-to books that they can leverage to grow their businesses. And out of that, I started a podcast called the Published Author Podcast. And I interview authors, which is something I just love to do. And so the podcast is really just an excuse for me to get to talk with amazing authors. And so I interview best-selling authors, I interview beginning authors, I interview literary agents and editors and ghostwriters and anybody who's involved in the publishing industry. I'll bring them on the podcast and just talk to them about what their job is and what they do. And when I interview authors, I'm not interviewing them so much about their book. I'm interviewing them about how they wrote their book. So how did they get the idea? How did they get started? Did they get stuck anywhere? How did they move past that challenge? That's the type of stuff I cover on my podcast to help other aspiring authors see, okay, here are all the different ways that a book can be written and to get ideas that might help them on their author journey.
Beautiful. And tell us now, if we take a step back and look at all the journeys you've had, what would you say has truly shaped the way you look at life, your journeys? Is it more, coming from your family, your culture, your experiences living abroad? Can you tell us a little bit more about that, please? What shapes how you look at life and how you find more joy in your life?
Well, Andrea, when you invited me to be on this podcast and I learned that it was about joy, that got me excited because I was raised in my faith, my religion. It's the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, more commonly known as Mormons. But the word joy carries a lot of weight in our religion. We have scriptures that are specific to our church that focus on that word joy. One of them says, man is that he might have joy. And so for us, we believe the entire purpose of life, of God and religion and faith and following God, all of this is joy. And if you think about this, it's logical, right? I mean, if you have joy, if you're happy, nothing else really matters. And if you don't have joy, nothing else really matters. And so it really all comes down to joy. And when we talk about joy, of course, we need to define that as not being just temporary happiness. You know, my daughter went to the Taylor Swift concert the other night. She was happy. She was feeling joy. But that's not really the kind of long-term joy we're after. That's a temporary type of thing. It's fun, right? But there's a different type of joy, the type of joy that somebody who's 90 years old, when they're on their deathbed and they look back on their life and they say, you know what, I'm happy with my life. I feel like I lived a good life. And yeah, I made mistakes, but I tried to make amends and I tried to do the best I could. And they're looking back on their life and they feel joy. That's a deeper type of satisfaction, or the joy that a parent feels when a child is born and they're holding that child and they feel that connection, or the joy that comes after 30 years after that child's born and you see them grow up and you see them have their own children and you see them progressing. That's a deeper type of joy. And that's the type of joy that I'm after because it's part of the faith that I was raised in. It was part of the culture in my home that my parents were not very focused on worldly things. It wasn't about making money. It wasn't about having stuff. It wasn't about just having fun, although we had fun and we had stuff. We liked to live indoors and wear clothes and things. You know, so my parents appreciated things, but it wasn't the center of our lives. The center of our lives was really relationships. It was family. And that's what mattered most as my parents were raising us. And they made that clear to us that the thing that mattered most to them was that I and my brothers and my sister, that we loved each other and that we cared for each other and that we would maintain these relationships. And now my parents are still both alive. And whenever I talk to them, they always say, hey, we hope that you and your wife still love each other, that you're getting along. That's what matters most to them because they know that those things are where we find the deepest, most fulfilling source of joy.
I really love the distinguishment between indeed happiness and joy, which is so much more profound and so transformational as well in terms of how we look at ourselves and also this world. So when you basically think about all your life and where you started, and you've done so many different things often, and I'm thinking now of my kids, right? And as they reflect on what careers they want to pursue and so on, did you actually imagine yourself to be doing such diverse things when you started your career journey? And what lessons can we have for the younger generations that are now potentially exploring where to go, which universities to pursue, what type of studies to, explore to basically create their own life? Tell us more a little bit about that, please.
I'm absolutely not in a place that I ever would have dreamed of when I was younger. When I was a kid, I wanted to be an artist. I wanted to go to this school called Art Center in Pasadena, California, near where I grew up. And that was my dream. I was going to go to Art Center and I was going to be a professional artist and I wanted to illustrate book covers. That was my dream. And I went to a year of art school and then I learned about business and I thought, oh, this business stuff, entrepreneurship, this is so interesting. I didn't know you could even study this at school. I just had a one-track mind before and it was all about art. And when I learned about business, I thought, okay, I want art as a hobby, but business is what I want to do as a living. And so I went into business, and this was the mid 90s. So the internet was just coming out. And I thought, well, if I'm going into business, I should learn some of this tech stuff. So I switched into information systems and started studying technology. And I loved that. And I thought, oh, this is so interesting. I love this. This is great. And so I ended up graduating with a degree in information systems management, half business, half computer science. And I thought, well, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to go work for Intel or Microsoft or Dell Computers or some tech company. And I'll have this career and I'll climb the ladder. And then maybe someday I'll be like an upper level executive, or maybe I'll run one of these companies or something. And this is what I was thinking as I was going through college. When I graduated college, I had already started my own business and I had 10 employees. And so even just the day I graduated, I was already in a place that I hadn't been planning on while I was going through school. So then I'm running a business and I'm thinking, well, where is this going to go? And I thought, like I said earlier, I'm going to make $1 million by the time I'm 30, and this will be a huge business and I'll do all these amazing things. And that business didn't make me $1 million. And I ended up going on very different paths. And I ended up writing for Forbes and becoming a writer and an author, which is not something I had ever planned on. So there were all these twists and turns to my story that I hadn't planned on, but I look back and I think, am I happy with the path? Yeah, I mean, there's some of the bumps that maybe I could have passed up on that weren't that fun, but they were good learning experiences. But overall, I'm thrilled with where I am and the path that I'm on and the opportunities that are in front of me. And I thought it was interesting when I wrote my first book, The Chief Marketing Officers at Work book, I asked every one of the executives I interviewed, where did you start out and was this part of your plan? The same question. And 90% of the executives said, I had no idea I would be the head of marketing for a big company someday. Most of them didn't even start out in marketing. They started out in something completely unrelated to marketing, but events came along and they made choices and they found themselves leading marketing for a huge company. I interviewed 30 executives for that book, and I think two of the executives actually had a background in education and marketing, and the other 28 had done something totally unrelated, but they still ended up there. And I think that's part of the fun of life is that no matter where you start, everybody's life is going to have twists and turns. I don't think anybody really ends up where they plan to be. And I think that's part of the fun of life is seeing where it takes you. I mean, that's what makes it exciting.
So if we now look at Josh and we take away your name, your background, your culture, your diplomas, how would you define yourself in 2, 3, 4 words?
It's always awkward to define yourself, right? Because there's the aspirational part of how you want to be defined. And then there's the part of if you're looking at yourself honestly, how do you define yourself? If I were looking at myself honestly, I'd probably say scattered, but driven, ambitious, but kind of skipping around from one thing to another, something like that. If I were looking at it aspirationally, then I would just hope that people would look at me and say, hey, he's somebody who wants to help people and he went around doing good things. That's what I want people to say. I've found that, I mean, when we talk about joy, there's the things that we've done right. And then there's the opposite, the things that we've done wrong. And the thing that gives me the most joy is helping people maximize their potential. The biggest regrets I have in life are the times when I've said something or done something that made somebody else feel like they were less than, that made them feel like they were stuck. Not that they weren't living up to their potential, because sometimes people need a kick in the pants to say, hey, you're better than this. You can do more than this. You're not doing all that you can do. Sometimes people need that, but it's those moments where I maybe said something that made people feel like no matter what I do, I'll never be enough and I might as well not try. Those are the moments that I really regret, those little offhand comments or just little mean things you say when you're a kid. And I still think back to some of the things I said to people when I was in grade school. I'm just like, oh, why did I say that thing to that person? I feel so bad. Like, and maybe I'm overthinking how much influence I had on their lives with some little thing that I said, but I know things that people have said to me when I was younger that hurt. And I just, I feel bad about the little things that I said that might have held somebody back in some small way rather than encouraging them to maximize their potential.
So this is actually a great introduction to the next question that I had for you that relates to what can we do collectively as humans on this planet to bring more joy to this world?
Well, when I was young, my dad drew a diagram on a chalkboard and he said, okay, here's the circle and this is you when you're born. And he drew a bunch of arrows pointing to that circle. And he said, when we're babies, we're just 100% selfish. We just take everything in that we can grab. We don't think about anybody else when we're babies. And then as we grow up, those arrows start to shift around and they start to point outwards because we realize that we're here to help other people and we start to serve other people. And that's how we grow. And that's how we find real joy is in serving others. And I think there's a lot of truth that the more that we serve others, the more joy we feel ourselves. But I think it's a little bit more nuanced than that because we have a tendency to then grow up and think, okay, I need to forget about myself and not think about myself and just sacrifice for other people and give, give, give. And I don't think that's 100% the way things should be either. I think if we look out on a long time horizon and we're looking 100 years into the future, 200 years into the future, what we'll see is that complete selfishness and complete selflessness tend to align with each other so that there's no difference. In other words, the things that we can do to bring ourselves the greatest joy that are the best things for us, if we're thinking totally selfishly, are the exact same things that bring others joy and that serve others if we're thinking completely selflessly. And so there really is no difference between selfishness and selflessness if we're looking at the long term. Now, if we're looking at the short term, what benefits me today? well, then we can find huge differences between selfishness and selflessness. But if we're looking at the long term, there really is no difference. It just shrinks down to the point where they're one and the same. And I think once we understand that, we will make different choices about the things we do today. And we will find that the sacrifices, the so-called sacrifices that we make, aren't really sacrifices at all. They're the best thing possible. And we'll find joy even in the midst of making what most people would call sacrifices. I mean, when we moved to Asia for 6 years to go find our daughter, a lot of people would say, oh, that was such a sacrifice and that must have been so hard and everything. No, I was having a great time. It was a great adventure. I was having a lot of fun. For me, it was not a sacrifice because I've learned how to find joy in the journey and in the challenges. And you see this in some people where no matter what happens to them, they never get shaken. I mean, I definitely have down days. I have days where I'm depressed, weeks where I'm depressed and down and feeling like nothing's going right and my life is a mess. But you see people who they face challenges, but they seem to have fun with those challenges. Well, what's the difference between somebody who confronts a challenge and has fun and somebody who has the same challenge and it just wrecks them and they go into a state of depression? I think a lot of it has to do with the long-term perspective, looking at life and saying, hey, this is today, but I'm looking at the long term here, and you don't get stuck in that short term.
And this resonates with me so much. And as you know, I've done a TEDx talk and it was actually called How to Find Joy in Adversity. Because often it's so easy for us to fall into the trap of victimhood when things go wrong and we're facing so many challenges that we forget that we can still find joy even when we're surrounded by darkness.
And I think some people would look at it and think like, oh, that's just a coping mechanism. You're just covering up the real suffering that's going on underneath. But I think if you do this the right way, you can legitimately find joy in the most difficult circumstances. And I don't judge anybody who doesn't. I don't judge anybody who struggles because we all do. We're all imperfect. We're all short-sighted. But the only reason I share this is not to judge anybody who's not finding joy in those challenges, but to say, you don't have to. Like, you can let this stuff go. And maybe it's hard. Maybe it takes a long time to learn how to do that. But I definitely think it's possible to find joy even in the midst of our challenges, no matter how great they are.
Right. So, Josh, to finish off the interview, I just have some very quick, simple questions for you. One, if you had to make a journey somewhere and you could only bring one item with you that could bring you more joy, what would that item be?
Well, my wife's not an item, but I would bring my wife with me because that would bring me the most joy to share whatever the experience was with her. Does that count?
Yes. So beautiful. It's true. So no suitcases. We just go on the journey as long as we have each other. It's all about the journey and the experience we're about to embark on. I love it. Tell us a fun fact about you that not many people know.
I can do a kickflip on a skateboard.
Love it. Any final thoughts you'd like to share with our audience today?
This has just been so great, Andrea, to talk about this. This is not a topic I've had the chance to discuss in depth on anybody else's podcast. And I really do feel like joy is what life is all about. And it is the purpose of our very existence and our very being. And I love discussing it because this is the journey we're all on. We're trying to figure out how to find joy and peace in our lives. And the more we discuss it, the more we figure out how to produce it. So thank you for providing this service.
Thank you for your time and for all the wisdom you have shared with everyone today.
Thanks so much, Andrea.